I'm James Conlon, Richard Seaver, music director of Los Angeles Opera. Oedipus Rex by Stravinsky, written in 1927, therefore almost 100 years ago, is a hybrid piece. If you like categories, called it an opera oratorio, and that's part of its fascination. This opera oratorio takes place while the city of Thebes is experiencing an epidemic, a pest, as they call it. And that's I think, a very important part of why it's important, because it's one of those works that shows, of course, in its very special way, the populace, all of us, reacting to this seen and unseen menace. And because of these are still early scientific years in terms of Western civilization's understanding of science, the Greeks attributed anything, earthquakes, storms, epidemics, to the gods, as they attributed everything to the gods. And so if they're having an epidemic, they have to pray to the gods. They have to ask the gods why. And so, of course, the answer is going to come back because there is a murderer who is king, and that, of course, is Oedipus. And the famous story of Oedipus, who unknowingly murders his father and weds his widow, who is his mother. Unknowns to all, of course, it will be discovered at the end, because why? The oracle and the gods know the real story. And so that's the drama of Oedipus, because it's been expressed in many ways over many centuries since it's been written. And of course, Freud used it as the very basis of his theories of psychoanalysis. But for Stravinsky, it's an occasion to make an opera, but to make it the way he wants to make it. And what is that? He wanted to have something where he could impose all of his list of desires without any compromise to the tradition. So there is nothing is being written because, well, this is what you do when you make an opera. And in fact, he made some very basic choices in order to preserve that option. Now, his first interesting choice was to write it in Latin, and specifically so that nobody really understood. And unless you happen to be a Latin scholar, and there are not too many of those running around these days, but there weren't that many in 1927. So he wanted a certain distance between the audience, the spectator, the listener, and the actual work. And he so much wanted to distance let's say the aesthetic, far away from the Italian opera, let's say, or the great German romantic operas of Wagner, where there are great emotions being expressed in a very direct way. He stylized most of it. So instead of having a chorus that has feelings, they're literally a Greek chorus in the classical sense. They comment, they participate to a degree, but always controlled. And then we have our several important characters in the opera, and they all, in the original production, stood like statues, delivered, and the interaction was minimal, or none at all. The libretto was written by the famous French writer Jean Cocteau, who was a fairly young man at the time, and this was a slight departure from his style, but he brought in many of his elements into this. But Stravinsky ruled the roost, and he used what he wanted, he commanded it, he shaped it. There was a narrator, and the narrator would speak in the vernacular because it was premiered in Paris. That dialogue was in French, but it's always been translated ever since that time. And of course, Stravinsky lived long enough to see Oedipus Rex being performed around the globe, and he himself recorded it conducting in America, in Washington. So there was a narrator in English. There's another famous recording made in Germany, in Cologne, with, of course, the narrator is in German. So the narrator speaks to the audience in its own tongue, but after that, you're on your own because you're not really going to understand the words unless you take the trouble to read them with a translation. And that was the way he wanted that to. That's the way he wanted it to work. In other words, about distance. Well, let's start with how Oedipus Rex is different from the operatic canon. The answer to that would be very. And if you go either into the great Italian tradition or into the great German tradition, and to a great degree also into the French and certainly the Russian tradition, this is not a work that wants to wallow in its own emotions, where its characters are going to have these great feelings and are going to express them to and for and against each other. They're not going to react in a great emotional way. There are not going to be great arias of vocal display. Now, there are short musical passages that one can say imitate arias, but are not exactly that. And each character has at least one of them. Oedipus, of course, has several short ones. Jocasta is the queen, has the most operatic scene where she has a traditional, I would say more Baroque, more like the Matthew Passion than like an opera, but she has a slow section, she has a fast section, and she has a slow section that returns. That's a typical ABA structure, we call it, that is absolutely fundamental to the Baroque tradition. But the music does not sound Baroque. So he, for the purposes of distancing himself from anything that really precedes him, he's setting out on his own. He's setting out on his own territory, and part of how he does that is to remove himself and to reject just about all traditions, and just get started and doing things his way. Now, how is that different or the same of other pieces by Stravinsky? In the first case, it's very much Stravinsky because he was revolutionary, because he made certain decisions at times that he was going to tear away at all traditions. That's how he changed the musical world with The Rite of Spring, barely 15 years before Oedipus Rex. He just simply broke all the rules, broke down all the restraints, and he created something which, of course, shocked and people booed, and it was considered a scandal, but it got its place very quickly as one of the most important, groundbreaking masterpieces, and has remained in the repertory ever since. So he's been doing this in other ways with other works. I would say that the difference is, by this time in his life, he has removed himself from his cultural roots. Now, his cultural roots, of course, are Russian. He's 100% Russian. He studied with Rimsky-Korsakov in St. Petersburg, and his earlier works, I should say, The Firebird, the other opera that is earlier, The Nightingale, Le Rossignol, you can hear the remnants of that Russian character and soul that he learned from Rimsky and from his surroundings. But he was, of course, an immigrant all of his life. He was outside of Russia at a certain time, and he could not go back, so he never went back. And in fact, he became, in many respects, an international composer. And what I mean by that is that it soon became irrelevant to him where he was living or whatever his roots might have been. He was writing his own music. And I think the best comparison would be made with Picasso. Picasso had very, very clear roots in Catalonia, in Spain, and you can feel that in a lot of his works. But at a certain moment, it becomes about Picasso, and it becomes about Picasso's manipulation of what we see, of objects, and he becomes an entity in himself. So that when you see Picasso, you're seeing Picasso. You're not seeing the reflection of a culture. And it had already become that for Stravinsky. And by the time of Oedipus Rex, that Russianness is fading into the background, is almost gone. And Stravinsky is Stravinsky. And you take him or leave him, whichever, on his terms. You should give Oedipus Rex a chance. If you don't know it, you should listen to it. If you don't like it, listen to it again, because a lot of it will make more sense and will reverberate with you the second time. And if you do like it, listen to it a second time and a third time and a fourth time, because it's going to grow on you. The work is not long. It's very concise, 55 minutes. And I think in those 55 minutes, he's managed to create one of those unique pieces that there's no mistaking that it's 100% Stravinsky, but holds our attention now almost 100 years after it was written. Oedipus Rex, and recording it in this COVID fashion, is one of the projects into which we put a great deal of thought and energy, and which we are now rejoicing in as we see it become realized. It has to be done under very strict circumstances. The circumstances are dictated by social distancing, which has a profound effect on how we actually perform. It's customary to say necessity is the mother of invention. We've had to invent. And so what will you see, or what will you want to know about how did we get to where we're going to be? How did we get there? And it had to be built up in layers. The first layer was to record the entire piece with the orchestra as a certain kind of soundtrack. Now, why do you say, well, why don't you do the chorus and solos at the same time? Well, no amount of space would have been sufficient to spread everybody out in such a way that we could do that well. I can say with relative surety that when I stepped up on the podium to conduct the first rehearsal and the recording sessions with the orchestra, I have never stood before an orchestra that was as far away from me as on that occasion. And that's so that there's sufficient distance between every instrument as is defined by the COVID restrictions. Now that creates, I won't say a nightmare, but it creates a challenge to all of the musicians and to me, because you have to coordinate the sound of every member of the orchestra that is at 3 times, 4 times, 5 times even, the normal distance. Now, orchestras sit close together for a reason. It's so that they can hear each other very well, and so that there's an immediacy about the sound, and they can react all at the same time. String players sit in pair. Violinist, one can turn the page. When the time comes for page turning comes, the other can continue playing. All of those things are out the window when you're recording under these circumstances. So there's a lot of challenge to it. First of all, I saw a very happy orchestra on our first day and on our last day. The LA Opera Orchestra, which is a world-class orchestra, was so happy to be reunited with itself. The musicians amongst themselves, they were so happy to be playing again and playing together as an entity that is a part of their identity. They threw themselves into it completely. And considering that we had not seen each other for over a year, that's pretty amazing. Because an orchestra, symphony orchestra, an opera orchestra, it's a wonderful, beautiful human organism. It's made up of human beings, but it has to run like a car. Everything has to function. The wheels, the brakes, the horn, the lights, everything has to function in an orchestra the same way a car functions. And having not driven this particular car for a year, everybody was on their toes and they reacted beautifully. So the next step is to layer onto that the chorus. And that's a challenge as well. So what's happening at this level now is that the orchestra soundtrack, as it were, has been mixed and it's being played for the chorus. They've had their rehearsals. They are now singing to the sound of that soundtrack, and they are coordinating themselves with that. The next step is when we bring the soloists in, and we not only record them and film them, that's going to be a type of performance. And they too are going to be doing this now to the background of both chorus and orchestra. And I'll be there with them, helping to coordinate all of that. It was a beautiful feeling the first day of our rehearsals to see everybody. Of course, we all had masks on, including me. So a few cases I wasn't quite sure who was there, but eventually, of course, I spoke to everybody. It was a homecoming. It was better than the first day of school. It was reuniting all of us as we've been separated for such a long time. It was a very joyful event. I start by saying that the choice is appropriate for the time of an epidemic or pandemic. The very words epidemic and pandemic are Greek words. And it's very common in literature, mythology, especially older mythology, to attribute epidemics to a fault or to a weakness on the part of a king, a queen. And we see a lot of it in the Bible, where there are plagues. For instance, the plagues were used as a way to pressure the Pharaoh to let Moses take the people of Israel out of Egypt. So these stories are old, and they're quite common at the time. Now, of course, we have a different view in a scientific age, but still it reverberates with something very, very human. And I think that that's a great reason to choose this piece at this time, aside from all of its other values, its musical values, its dramatic values, its vocal and choral values, and of course, it's a great piece for the orchestra. When people ask me what they have to know before they come to the opera, I like to say nothing. Just come to the opera the way you go to a movie, or the way we used to go to the movies, or you turn on Netflix on your television. You don't have to know anything. We're going to tell you a story, and we want you to hear that story and to watch that story. So you don't have to know anything. Now, if there are going to be surtitles, that's going to help you through the Latin, of course. Nobody expects you or anybody else to speak Latin these days. So you don't have to prepare yourself. Now, if you want to prepare yourself, just refresh your memories if you've known about it before, or if you're hearing it for the first time. Get to know the story of Oedipus, his tragedy, why he's a tragedy. He is abandoned as a child in order to protect him and his parents from a dire warning of the oracle that he would kill the king. And without knowing it, eventually when he grows up, he does kill the king unknowingly, because he didn't know he was the king. And he goes back to Thebes, and he's a great hero because he defeated the Sphinx. Who's the Sphinx? Well, you can read about the Sphinx. And he marries the queen, and the queen happens to be his mother, and everything's fine for a while until there's an epidemic. And then when there's an epidemic, the oracle, which for the ancient Greeks was the final reference, goes to the oracle. The oracle says, the murderer of a king is in your midst. You must get him out. And finally says, the murderer of a king is a king. And of course, that means Oedipus. And little by little, Oedipus will begin to understand, and his wife, the queen, Jocasta, will, I should say his wife and his mother, Jocasta, will understand too. And so he will end tragically. Why tragic? Because for the Greeks, the concept of tragedy was a great person of great accomplishment is going to fall from his or her heights because of hubris and arrogance. Or, in the case of Oedipus, simply because he transgressed the law of the gods, even though he transgressed it without realizing that he was doing so, he was still, in the eyes of the gods, disobedient. And so he is punished the way Adam and Eve are punished. It's the same story. The gods retain the right to punish human beings if they do not obey their laws. So that's all. That's all you have to know. The rest, you just come and enjoy it. I would like audiences to take away pretty much what I always want them to take away. I want them to take away an experience where they heard and saw something that gave them feelings that appealed to their ears and to their eyes, and they had an experience, a theatrical experience, just like going to the movies, and that they will be fascinated, moved, interested. Any reaction that you're moved to have, it's a good reaction. That's your reaction. And I hope it will whet their appetite to hear it again. And why is that so important? Because it's one of the characteristics, I believe, of classical music, that it grows on every hearing and rehearing of the work. And so I want this to be the first step in that line for Oedipus Rex, if you're hearing Oedipus Rex for the first time, Stravinsky, if you're hearing Stravinsky for the first time, and even an opera, if you're hearing an opera for the first time. I think it's also worth mentioning why it's appropriate to be doing a work of Igor Stravinsky, is that he was one of the many great artists, composers, writers who fled Europe at the time of the war. And he came to Los Angeles, and he lived here for approximately 30 years. So he has made it his home, and he left his stamp on our history right here in Los Angeles. I'm very happy to say that we are reopening our doors to the public with Oedipus Rex of Stravinsky, and to be able to welcome people back to the Chandler Pavilion, to be able to amass the Los Angeles Opera Orchestra and chorus and soloists on our stage to a live performance. It's been a long time in coming. We are confident in the future, and this is a great step and a great moment for us all to come together. We've been reunited amongst ourselves, rehearsing and preparing this work, but now we want to be reunited in person with our public, with you.